Good morning, everyone, and a very warm welcome to this session on basic income. My name is Mansour Njai, and I'm the head of Inclusive Growth with the United Nations Development Programme. Today's session will explore social protection responses to the COVID-19 pandemic with a specific focus on how basic income can help transition out of emergency cash transfers to address the effects of a crisis in a more sustainable way. For this, we have today 5 panelists from very different backgrounds, ranging from international organizations, governments, and academia, with the purpose of addressing the issue from very different perspectives. Today, we'll explore the challenges and opportunities of implementing basic income schemes, as well as its gender implications. The panel will also include a reflection on Iran and Colombia's experience with basic income. Finally, we will explore the future of basic income and how it can help governments transition from an emergency measure to a more permanent scheme. Panelists will have each 6 minutes to present their ideas and experience. Next, we'll have a Q&A session and closing remarks. To that end, please send your questions by clicking on the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen. Also note that we have a chat box available for you to exchange views throughout the session. Let me now introduce the speakers and panelists in the order that they will deliver their intervention. First, we have Ugo Gentilini, who's the global lead for social assistance at the World Bank Social Protection and Jobs Global Practice. Ugo has over 20 years of experience on social protections, empirics, and analytics, but also in providing technical and operational support to countries. Welcome, Ugo. Second, we have George Gray Molina, who is the head of policy engagement and chief economist with UNDP's Global Policy Bureau. He's a former chief economist at the Ministry of the Presidency in Bolivia, which is his home country. His work focuses on global trends, policy reform, poverty, and inequality. Welcome to you, George. We'll then have the Honorable Deputy Minister, Dr. Ahmad Mejdari from the Ministry of Cooperatives, Labor, and Social Welfare from Iran. He's a trained economist and a former member of the Economic Commission of the Parliament. His research focus in recent years has been on development economics, health, public insurance, social welfare, and social security system, universal basic income, poverty, and inequality. Our first speaker will be Ms. Laura Palbon, who's the Director of Social Protection in the Ministry of Planning of Colombia. Laura is a public policy expert and has worked for more than 8 years at the World Bank on labor market, poverty, social protection, and gender issues. She also served as Deputy Director of Education of the National Planning Department of Colombia. A very warm welcome, Laura. Finally, we'll have Louise Agg, who is Professor of Politics at the University of York and Chair Emeritus of the Basic Income Hearst Network, with which, by the way, UNDP is very closely related in terms of working on basic incomes. Professor Agg has acted as an expert on economic security with governments and international institutions, including the Council of Europe, the Organization of American States, and the World Bank. She is the author of a recent book titled The Case for Universal Basic Income. Let me also recognize the presence of Dr. Yekta Ashrafi, who's the Director of Economic Affairs Research Institute of Iran. Without further ado, I would also like to invite Ugo Gentilini to frame basic income as an instrument of social protection, its challenges and benefits. Ugo, over to you.
Thank you so much, Mansour, and great pleasure to be with all of you. Let me just reflect on 4 questions that often emerge in UBI debates. The first question is, what problem is UBI trying to solve? A UBI lends itself to at least 4 different narratives. You can think of a UBI as helicopter money to bolster consumer effective demand in crisis. You can imagine UBI as part of the automation story, where automation-induced unemployment called for new ways of thinking about unemployment insurance. You can frame UBI as a social dividend, where certain revenues are divided equally among its citizens. You can position UBI on a par with social assistance as part of broader social protection systems. And each of these 4 narratives has different design implications, especially in terms of benefit size. And there is also the underlying philosophy behind UBI that can also vary. A UBI can be motivated by a strategy to reduce public services, think of Friedman and Murray in the US, or as a platform to build stronger states, which is a little bit the spirit of the ILO recommendation 202. So a lot of diversity there. The second question is, what's the global experience with UBI? And there are over 30 experiences labeled as UBI, but not all of them are a true UBI. There are 5 basic categories. There are kind of quasi-UBI pilots, generally small scale with some form of targeting. There are full UBIs, which are also long-term, but on a small scale, like in Kenya. There are UBIs on a large scale, but with small amounts and yearly distributions like Alaska, and pure UBI at the national level were only implemented in 2 countries, Mongolia and Iran. And I want to comment on Iran. We're gonna hear much more in detail later. And there are a lot of lessons emerging from this full set of UBI and quasi-UBI responses. But there is also a growing pool of one-off schemes for everybody. In the past, we've seen those distributions in Kuwait, Australia, and Russia. And current COVID responses included the provision of cash to all members of society in Japan, Singapore, Hong Kong, Serbia, South Korea, and Tuvalu. And these have been often ramped up in parallel to a pre-existing social protection systems. So what are the effects of a UBI? What we know from micro simulations is that the distributional effects on poverty inequality depend on 4 major factors. They depend on the current configuration of the social protection system, its coverage, generosity, level of progressivity, etc. The introduction modality, is it a top-up or in substitution to other transfers? It depends what is being substituted and how it is financed. And depending on these choices and how they are combined, a UBI may or may not benefit those at the bottom of the distribution. And we run a number of simulations where we show that depending on those design choices, the effects would be different. And also, it's important to bear in mind the fiscal cost as well. And here again, it goes back to the objectives, looking at UBI as a sort of a symbolic transfer for social contracts versus meaningful transfers for poverty and inequality reduction. And depending on those design parameters, costs can vary from an average of about 2.6% of GDP to 24% of GDP on average, and even up to 50% of GDP in some low-income countries. These are static estimates, and in the long term, fiscal costs are also influenced by multiplier effects and behavioral responses by firms and household responses as well. My 4th question is, what does it take to implement the UBI in practice? And some delivery aspects are made easier by UBI compared to a typical social assistance program. The assessments of needs and conditions is made simpler, since eligibility is based on simpler criteria, but there could be an implicit assessment done via taxes, however. Communication and outreach is also reasonably simple as well, but other functions and components of the delivery chain may not be that easy. One has to ensure kind of universal ID systems, universal payment systems, universal management information systems for data reconciliation and updates. And we have seen that these are non-naive challenges even in some high-income countries. So just to conclude, a UBI needs to be discussed not in the abstract, but against the specific objectives it pursues. So those goals need to be clear, since a UBI can fit the radically different purposes and philosophies. A UBI sheds light on the need for universal social protection and provides a specific route towards it with pros and cons and trade-offs. And we need to consider how a UBI compares to existing alternatives in terms of coverage, adequacy, incentives, incidence, cost, political economy, and delivery. No program scores perfectly on all those criteria, and the choice would depend on sort of an optimal configuration across those indicators. And this configuration may well vary across countries and over time. The current experience of COVID may suggest that the universal one-off payment is becoming a monetary policy much less unconventional than it used to be a decade ago. But for the moment, we only see this in high-income countries, but it may continue and even grow in the future as an emergency response. There are some big questions with little evidence. There is a rich literature on the theoretical effects of UBI, but largely based on inference from other programs, like gender empowerment, on pensions, on labor markets effects, but on minimum wages. And all of these questions would need to be better researched. And that also includes questions on how well does the market need to work for not leading to inflation in key markets like food and housing. So I'll stop here, Mansour, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Ugo. That was very useful. I think it was very insightful, and really I note, the critical importance of having a proper design right from the start, to know exactly what purpose we're trying to serve here before getting into such a scheme. Thanks again. I will now invite George Gray Molina to please talk to the audience about the findings of two recent UNDP Commission's paper on TBI, and also from a gender perspective. George, the floor is yours. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Mansour, and thank you, colleagues. Delighted to join you. What I'll do is I'll focus a bit on a proposal that we made in the month of July of this year for a temporary basic income around the world to provide a basic income guarantee. And we did simulations with a colleague, Eduardo Ortiz, for 3 months, for 6 months, for 9 months. So allow me to describe 3 things about that proposal: the motivation, some of the implementation challenges, and then think about the future of basic incomes focusing on gender considerations. Let me start with the motivation. As Ugo just described, the basic income literature and practice may have different motivations for implementing unconditional cash transfers. The focus that we had in our own paper was to compare what was happening in the advanced economies over the past few months during the COVID crisis. And we saw unemployment insurance kicking in here in countries like the United States. We saw work furloughs in countries like Germany that could replace income and also conserve your job with a partial replacement of income. But then we saw 100 countries that didn't have a social insurance system and that were relying on social assistance, that is, cash transfers that were unconditional. So we were interested in following through, understanding the fairness criteria, how those expand using existing administrative registries, and we came up with 3 simulations. One is the idea of topping up existing social assistance programs in 3 thresholds. So if you're a country with a poverty rate of $1.90, it would be topped up to $3.20, and we did the simulations for that. If you're in a country with a $3.20 day poverty line, we would simulate a temporary basic income at $5.50. And finally, we did a final threshold at $13 a day. So after looking at those 3 top-ups, we take a look at some of the fairness considerations, and there is an interesting debate about whether we should be thinking about a single global threshold. So we did some simulations on $5.50, thinking about perhaps the $1.90 is too low, perhaps $3.20 is not adequate for some countries that are middle income or upper middle income. So we set it at 550. And finally, we did some cost adjustments for these lines. Now, after doing the simulation, what we find, of course, is that this is within reach. It's within the range of what is feasible, but there are two main challenges. And one is fiscal, and the other one is digital that concerns outreach. So let me start with the fiscal side. As you can imagine, the cost of these are quite expensive. Our simulations suggest that a top-up strategy, the least costly strategy, if you will, is about $299 billion a year for 132 countries. This is about 1% of GDP if we translate it into what developing emerging economies are spending right now. In some of the poorest economies, it shoots up all the way to 5, 7, or even 9% of GDP. In most emerging economies, in most of the large emerging economies, it ranges between 0.3 and 0.9%. What we did in that paper is we looked at different sources. Because this is a shock, because this is temporary, we would not recommend raising taxes for this, but rather thinking about repurposing existing resources of expenditures within the budget, or also link it to debt. So we took a look at the G20 debt suspension initiative that focused on 71 countries right now. And we did a thought experiment. Let's extend that to all middle income countries, to small island developing states. How much could we repurpose from debt servicing this year? And the number is quite big. It's $3.1 trillion that are owed by countries this year, 2020, on debt service from a stock of about 11 trillion. Although 2 trillion of those are for short-term debt, which is less than 1 year, and only 1 trillion is about more than 1 year. So that's probably the right focus there. But anyways, that was a benchmark for us to think about what is feasible, what could be done without north-south transfers at this moment, just thinking about a moratorium and a standstill. Let me focus on the second implementation challenge, which is common to most countries, which is digital. And we've seen tremendous innovation happening right now. Countries that are registering population through SMS and expanding coverage in record time, in weeks. We've seen biometric systems put in place very quickly, and also the use of digital technology for payments through mobile money or digital payments. Just to wrap it up, what is the future of this? How do we think through the graduation criteria of something like a TBI? And in my own view of this is that it's more linked to a social insurance policy than it is to a basic income policy. Although I think that's something that we need to discuss, and there are many interesting experiences around the world on UBI. But I think the social insurance side is the one that we're missing in most developing and emerging economies. Now, even the richest economies of the world had to top up their social insurance policies. As you know, social insurance is paid through contributory employers, mostly paying into a fund, which is then used for insurance. We saw in Canada, in the United States, and in Europe that those funds were topped up by fiscal resources during this crisis. So we need to rethink the architecture of this. Is it purely contributory? Is it a mix between contributory and non-contributory? Do we need to create a fiscal system that focuses on this? And just to finalize, one big issue that we're exploring right now, which we'll be writing a paper, we'll release that very soon, is about the care economy. And it's about what's the gender focus of a basic incomes policy. And there's a lot of interesting lessons from around the world. I'm afraid I didn't have enough time right now to delve into that, but I'll come back to it during the questions and answers, if you will, Mansour. So let me wrap up here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, George. I think two strong takeaway messages are: first, it's feasible, given the current debt levels over the world, but also, if you want to look forward, we really may need to look at social institutional policy to deal with this from a global perspective. Thanks again so much, George. Let me now invite His Excellency, Dr. Ahmad Meidari, to discuss briefly the main successes, challenges, and lessons learned from Iran's experience with UBI. Your Excellency, the floor is yours. Just to clarify also that you don't need to change your translation channel, you will hear it directly from your English channel, although it's translated from Persian. Over.
Just a second, Dr. Mehdi will join soon.
I am grateful and thank the organizers of this meeting, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak. We need to learn from each other, in particular when it comes to these important issues. I will go directly to the subject of the meeting. The first stage of UBI was implemented in December 2010, and since then, all households are paid on a monthly basis. Today, with a population of 85 million, about 78 million Iranians received cash transfers. The UBI was implemented for the second time in November 2019. This time, 16 million persons were included in the UBI. So 25 million were not paid any UBI. In both stages, the UBI source of funding was rising prices of gasoline and several other petroleum products. Countries willing to implement the UBI need to pay attention to a few important executive points. I'm going to address which are the important points in the Iranian experience with the UBI. First, which is the account of the head of the households. In 2010, people were asked to register on a site, on a website, and announce their national code of each family member, their residence address, and the bank account of the head of the household. For successful UBI implementation, bank accounts must be linked to the account holder's national ID number. Fortunately, in Iran, bank accounts have this feature. 2, the mobile number linked to the national number. The second point is that when they were not asked to introduce the mobile number linked to their national ID number when registering. This makes it difficult for the executive body providing the UBI to communicate with the people in case of any problem. For instance, many bank accounts are closed for various reasons, such as death, bounced checks, or other legal issues. In many cases, the account holder himself is not aware of the closure of his account. Therefore, no amount will be credited to his account. This causes them to refer to the relevant organization and waste their time and the time of that organization. The third point is that the address taken from the people's address was not accurate and standard, and we could not accurately determine the geographical distribution of the people. Fourth point, the fourth point is that we asked people to introduce their families. We found that members of a family, even if they don't live in the same city, have introduced themselves as a family. And this does not seem to be a problem in identifying the eligible individuals and certain low-income groups. Therefore, people should be asked to declare themselves as a family only when they live in a single residential unit. The UBI issue has been raised several times in Iran. Once in 2010, when the government announced that all people, that anyone wishing to receive a UBI should register. Almost 95% of the people registered. After the new government took office in 2013, people were asked to register in the system only if they considered themselves eligible. But again, almost all the people registered. Thus, our experience shows that it is not appropriate to leave the identification of the eligibility to the knowledge and self-declaration of the individuals. To identify the people in need, the government must have all the information about the family members, and it must be carefully defined. 6, also, very poor families have no access to internet, and many families do not have access to the internet, so another mechanism should be designed for the registration of these families. Thank you very much for your time and consideration.
Thank you so much, Dr. Meidari. This was very useful and quite impressive experience. We know that 70% of the household and the beneficiaries actually are receiving this cash transfer. We also noted the challenges in terms of identifying eligible individuals, but also the good point in terms of having a grievance mechanism that can allow people who are not part of the system to actually claim their benefits. Thank you again so much, and thanks for your contribution. Allow me now to turn to Laura Pabon to briefly discuss Colombia's experience with temporary basic income. Laura, the floor is yours.
Gracias, Mansur. Un saludo especial para todos los colegas que también están participando en este panel. Yo quisiera aprovechar este espacio para contarles la experiencia desde gobierno, desde implementadores de una aproximación a un ingreso básico, que es la experiencia que nosotros tuvimos con Ingreso Solidario en Colombia. Este es un programa no condicionado, es un programa focalizado y adicionalmente, como se tiene previsto, es un programa temporal por ahora en el marco de la emergencia para mitigación y para apoyar parte de la recuperación en la que debemos trabajar en 2021. Colombia antes de la pandemia contaba con 3 programas de transferencias monetarias condicionados. Nosotros no teníamos programas de transferencias monetarias no condicionadas en el país. Esto era parte adicionalmente del debate de reducción de pobreza, y es pensar en la necesidad de analizar la viabilidad de tener este tipo de programas para reducción de pobreza. Pero una vez llega la pandemia, nos encontrábamos con un grupo muy importante de hogares en condición de pobreza y vulnerabilidad económica, porque es la primera vez que focalizamos ayudas sociales para personas que están en situación de vulnerabilidad económica. Encontrábamos un grupo de hogares que por sus condiciones demográficas, por los mismos requisitos que tenían los programas de transferencias monetarias condicionados, es decir, que van focalizados a hogares con menores o aquellos hogares con jóvenes, pues no permitían que otros hogares con otras características demográficas en condición de pobreza y vulnerabilidad accedieran a estas ayudas. Y nos encontrábamos con esta situación que teníamos en Colombia alrededor de 3 millones de hogares en esta situación, desprotegidos, sin transferencias monetarias condicionadas y en condición de pobreza, pobreza extrema y vulnerabilidad económica. Es por eso que decidimos implementar un programa como ingreso solidario. Este programa, pues al igual que Irán, compartimos varios de los desafíos que ya han mencionado los otros panelistas. Teníamos algunos retos importantes en temas de identificación de la población. Nosotros tenemos nuestro instrumento de focalización. El instrumento de focalización es un instrumento que estaba desactualizado. La pandemia llega en un momento en el cual estábamos haciendo esa actualización de la base de datos con información de los hogares que nos permitía mejorar esos procesos de focalización. No obstante, pues este proceso de actualización de la base de datos no se había concluido. Entonces enfrentábamos un primer reto de tener información desactualizada en algunos casos, de no tener la información completa de todas las personas que requerían esas ayudas. De ahí empezamos a construir una base maestra, así la denominamos, que es una primera versión de un registro social de hogares que integrara información de las dos versiones que en este momento teníamos de nuestro instrumento de focalización, que es el SISBEN, de la tercera versión, que es la que está vigente, y la cuarta versión, que es la que estamos actualizando. Y esto incluía también que pudiéramos hacer interoperabilidad con otros registros administrativos, de tal forma que pudiéramos consolidar una base más actualizada que pudiera ayudarnos a identificar y a localizar a las personas. Segundo reto es en el tema de localización. Teníamos personas que sabíamos que estaban en condición de pobreza y vulnerabilidad, que sabíamos que requerían estas ayudas, pero la única información que nosotros teníamos era información de la base de datos de SISBEN. Aquí fue muy necesario trabajar de la mano con los municipios, con las entidades territoriales, de tal forma que ellos pudieran también ayudarnos a hacer algunas búsquedas activas de los beneficiarios que sabíamos que en medio de la pandemia requerían de estas ayudas. Utilizamos una cantidad de mecanismos y estrategias de comunicación para incentivar a las personas a consultar si hacían parte de esta base. Y otro punto importante, nosotros en nuestros programas de transferencias monetarias condicionadas en el pasado, hacíamos unos procesos masivos de convocatorias. Dada la pandemia, pues teníamos que recurrir a otras estrategias que realmente evitaran este tipo de personas aglomeradas. Entonces fue necesario que usáramos la información, usáramos medios digitales, usáramos también medios a través de comunicación a través de las mismas entidades territoriales, porque teníamos que evitar a toda costa, en medio de la pandemia, la aglomeración. Los pagos también fue otro de los desafíos que nosotros enfrentamos. Es muy difícil en estos casos, dado que no teníamos un proceso de inscripción y de convocatoria, pues llegarle a esos 3 millones de beneficiarios con los pagos. Tuvimos adicionalmente que diseñar varias estrategias de la mano de las entidades financieras, de las entidades bancarias, para incentivar el uso y apertura de productos digitales, de tal forma que evitáramos que las personas tuvieran que acercarse a las entidades bancarias. Eso fue otro gran reto. Tuvimos también que trabajar con todos los operadores de telefonía celular para que ellos trataran también de ayudarnos a localizar con sus bases de datos, que tienen reserva, por supuesto, localizarlos, enviarles un mensaje de texto, contarles además del link o el acceso que tienen para que hagan la descarga de ese producto financiero. Ese fue otro reto operativo que hemos tenido. En este momento es importante también resaltar que pese a todos estos retos, pues el programa ya lleva 5 meses en funcionamiento. El alistamiento que tuvimos que hacer, lo tuvimos que hacer en casi 3 semanas. Solamente tuvimos 3 semanas para organizar todo el programa y salir a hacer los pagos. De esta forma, pues logramos llegar a eso.
Laura, I'm going to ask you to please wrap up. We're unfortunately running out of time. Thank you.
Okay. De esa forma, pues logramos llegar a esos 3 millones de beneficiarios, ya estamos en eso, y el programa pues tendrá su continuidad en 2021. Muchas gracias.
Thank you so much, Laura. That was very, very useful and really focusing on the challenges, notably, identifying the beneficiaries, also the challenges in terms of payment system. I think those are universal, challenges from which all countries can really build on. Thanks again. Let me now turn to Professor Haag to please share her views on what she sees as the future of UBI, in transitioning from emergency cash transfers. Professor Haag, the floor is yours. Professor Haag, can you hear me?
Yes. Sorry. I have only just joined. Am I supposed to talk now?
Yes, please. You have the floor.
Okay. Well, well, thank you very much for inviting me. I apologize. I haven't heard the presentations. I've been teaching all day and I've just literally returned home now. So I may be repetitive or not properly reflect on what people have said. I apologize for that. But I was asked to talk about what's next for UBI, and now that it's become popular in the context of the pandemic. So since I only have, I think, 6 minutes, I'll be quickly declare where I stand on this. In terms of risk and perspective, I perhaps should preface that by saying, to be even more provocative, is there anything new? I think not much may change, or not much has changed, other than that we have this new popular term that we stick on to things we're already doing and giving some sort of new direction. And that could turn out to be important. But I think most of what we're seeing in the discussion that's framed around basic income, of course, isn't basic income. And also the sentiments around basic income as a stable institution, as I like to think about it, are not necessarily expressed in the way that basic income is being talked about now. So in terms of risk, I think, and I've talked about in my publications about how the very rapid ascendancy of the term basic income, in particular during crisis, it presents a number of devil's deals of different kinds, including, as already mentioned, misappropriation of the terms, a misunderstanding of the term, misdirection of the value or the intentions of the reform, rushing to calculate costs of a UBI without context or a temporal perspective. It's very few countries could afford anything like a rapid move to UBI, and I'm sure that has been mentioned by the earlier speakers. And finally, setting UBI somehow outside of the systemic context in which I think it belongs. And so I'll start by talking a little bit about that context. And I think we need to ask ourselves, why are people using the term UBI for what are quite different things? So for example, UBI is now talked about in terms of anti-poverty policy. This is a very new meaning of the term, a very new context in which to discuss UBI. When really I think a basic income is about systemic change. It's about promoting a sense of stability and equality in society as a whole. It's about creating a sense of unity of entitlement and rules on the basis of which more shared risk, sense of freedom in society are possible. Behavioral experimentation. So there's quite a lot of behavioral experimentation around UBI. Will it decrease incentives, which I think we now have conclusive evidence to suggest that basic security does not have that, does not have a disincentive effect, but really the context matters. And it may be other things that cause disincentive effects, like weak labor markets, weak opportunities, and we should be looking at the system as a whole when we're looking at incentives and not just at income security, and that does concern me. I did a survey in Sao Paulo in the mid-2000s, which looked at motivation rather than behavior, and I compared a district in the central Sao Paulo in the slums, and I looked at the effect of external income security in combination with employment history and employment stability and education. And I found that first of all, it was the coincidence of these factors that made for more intrinsic motivation. And without the contributing sources of stability and opportunity, cash grants had not negative effect as such, but has almost minimal impacts on incentives. So we need to be careful. That was published in World Development in 2011. And I think one answer to the problem is that UBI has been given a job, or jobs perhaps, that it never applied for. And that is what happens in a crisis context. Is now trying to squeeze into a tight or different frames than what is really suited to. And I think two examples of this are emergency payments. I think they may be a good idea in their own right. And I think the UBI form of such payments, low conditionality, uniformity and so on, may be a good idea in a crisis. But of course, we all know that it's not sustainable financially, and that then creates other problems, which I'm sure others would have talked about. And the other one is redistribution. I think this is really a misappropriation of the intention. And that's, I think, however, becomes the premise that UBI somehow ought to redistribute resources when we're talking about anti-poverty policy. I don't think that's something that UBI can do, certainly not on its own, and that is reflected in recent reports I've read, very good reports by the World Bank. And with the exception of resource-rich states or states with very high levels of finance and GDP, UBI, A, would be difficult to implement short-term, and B, would not have redistributive effects, particularly. It's other factors that would enhance a UBI's effect in that sense. So I think we need to bear all of these contextual factors in mind. For me, the purpose of UBI is not redistribution, not that I think redistribution is not important. It's not even distribution as such, but it's something else. It's about relatedly political and human development. So it's about forging a sense of shared entitlement in society, and to create a foundation for a more stable development model on the basis of which other policies can be more effective. So for me, it's about institutional development as a sort of gradual process and aim. But having said that, I think in that kind of context, which I think is a more appropriate context in which to talk about UBI, UBI can have immediate positive effects on institution building in the sense that it can help consolidate the very unstable approach to cash grants that has sort of the cash grants have sort of gradually become more stable. But the design still presumes some sort of instability in the sense of the premise of exit, the premise of psychological change in the beneficiaries that's pressed for conditionalities and so on. I think they have caused, as we have seen many reports testify to, they've caused as many problems as they in fact have solved in terms of returning individuals to poverty and creating social psychological negative impacts. So I think UBI is a very good thing in the long term. I'm surprised it's not come up sooner. I expected it to be taken up by the World Bank sooner. It's now been taken up, but I do think, and other agencies, including the IMF, but I do think there's still quite a long way to frame UBI in the right way, which to me is not redistributive, but in terms of institution building.
Thanks so much, Professor. Could you please wrap up now? Thanks.
Yes, so we have a paradox. So I call it the equality paradox, which is that countries which have some of the features which are necessary to sustain a UBI, a high degree of formalization of the economy, of socialization of resources in general. I mentioned level of share of public finance and GDP, levels which can only be sustained if lower income groups and middle income groups contribute at a high level. And essentially forms of political development associated with the creation and legitimacy of shared risk. So we're talking about redevelopment of more stable employment and of the institutions around it. All of these things, I think, are premises for sustainable UBI, but the countries who have those things may not need a UBI as urgently. Although I do think, in the high income states, what we're seeing is a case for UBI emerging around the introduction of more punitive social policies, which a UBI would help address, whereas the countries who most need more stable institutions cannot afford them. And these are countries relatedly with high inequality. So what that presents is necessarily a long-term scenario. Right? That might not be as exciting as we might want it to be, but I think it's important to focus on that long-term institution building scenario and the other things that are necessary in terms of building shared risk. It really is the development challenge, I think, into which UBI falls.
Thank you so much, Professor Haag. This was very useful. I think the fact that you mentioned that this is about really building institution and having a sense of shared entitlement in the longer term, and this speaks to also the context that really matters in such a case. Thanks again. I think we only have 15 minutes left, and I'll really now turn to the audience to raise questions. We have a number of questions in the box. What I'm gonna do is really give you 2 minutes each. That's unfortunately 2-3 minutes each. That's the maximum we can do. I'm gonna start with George. We have a question from Yankee, and which is about in Nepal, for instance, how do they transition from a TBI as a 6 months long emergency cash transfer to something that's more sustainable? How would you go about it? Over to you, George.
Thank you so much, Mansoor. I think the key question of graduation, of course, requires some context and thinking about how the COVID crisis plays out over the next 12, 18 months. I think there'll be no graduation before we don't see a health response that's universal in this sense. So thinking about a horizon of 2022, in which we have vaccination, in which we have treatment available to most of the population, we'll see then, I believe, a proper transition away from what might be a TBI. What are some of the things that countries are already talking and thinking about? Two things in general. One is the link to social insurance, which is something that I discussed earlier, that has to do with the lack of unemployment insurance, the lack of an institutional framework for that in countries that have very low contributory payroll systems. The second link is something that we are discussing in the UNDP right now, which is thinking about the care economy and how to build in, not as a compensation mechanism, but into the architecture of labor markets and social protection, how to build in a publicly funded care system in developing and emerging economies. And I think that's a discussion that links into something that we've been discussing earlier, which has to do with gender equality, with a leveling of the playing field, but also thinking about that architecture is coming out of the crisis. We'll be releasing a paper in the next few weeks on this, on unpaired care work and how the effects that the COVID crisis may have on women's labor participation, which we predict to be negative. And we run some simulations on how a policy could build up out of the TBI and into a care economy funded by the public sector. But let me stop there. Over to you, Mansoor.
Thank you so much, George. That was very useful. Let me now turn to Ugo. Ugo, one of the questions you have is about the green UBI. So the question is, have you come across any example of related finding that support the view that green UBI would make the transition to a green economy in developed countries? Mm-hmm. What are your views on that?
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Mansoor. Yeah, I've also was monitoring the questions. I guess there are also a couple of others, but starting with the one from Cecilia, and hi, Cecilia. I think that that sort of narrative of a climate-sensitive UBI fits into the narrative of social dividends, which I mentioned. And what comes to mind is, the work by, for example, the Climate Leadership Council, which I think in 2017 published a paper, the conservative case for carbon dividends. And even the city where I live, Washington D.C., did have legislation for some sort of climate dividend, where carbon taxes, some of the revenues from carbon taxes would be redistributed to citizens. So there is that sort of very vibrant literature and actually even some legislation being tabled. Mansoor, there were a couple of questions. If you don't mind, I'll go for them as well. One was from Jacob on the job guarantees versus UBI. I think that the job guarantee programs, there is a big debate there. Why not giving people jobs, guaranteeing jobs instead of guaranteeing income? I think that the state is seen as a last resort employer, and there are public jobs to anyone who wants to work at a minimum wage. I think that there are a number of experiences with quasi job guarantee programs. India and Rega is very close to it. Maybe the US New Deal Public Works as well. I think that some of the concerns there were on the kind of not only providing jobs, but to what extent meaningful jobs and not dead-ended jobs could be provided. And the work by Martin Ravalian, for example, on India showed that rationing that only 56% of applicants to the jobs guarantee program actually got a job, and largely because of administrative issues. But there is a very, very vibrant debate there with Philip Harvey and Pavlina Cherneva and many others, a fascinating one. There is one question also from Michael, I think. I haven't come across that sort of arrangement where the unused UBI will be returned to the state. A few specific cash transfer schemes on a small scale come to mind, but nothing of the sort on a wider scale.
Thank you so much, Ugo. That was very useful. Let me now turn to Dr. Medari. We have a question from Zahra, who actually would like to know what work is Iran doing on making the social protection system more shock responsive, as is being done in a number of Middle Eastern countries. Over to you, Dr. Medari's team.
Could you please repeat the question?
Sure, yes, if it helps. The question is also available in the chat box. The question is, what work is Iran doing on making the social protection system more shock responsive? Along with COVID, there are other shocks. So the question is, what else is being done in Iran to absorb those type of shocks? Even though, the UBI history and use of COVID response in Iran sounds very impressive.
Thank you very much for the discussions and for the question. Maybe there isn't enough time to explain all the things that we have done, but I can forward a document that can explain in details the experience of Iran in this regard. Let me briefly explain the COVID-19 situation. We are seeking a unified window of social services, and we are trying to use all digital tools quickly. We have updated our digital tools toolbox, and we had very good cooperation with the different UN agencies in this regard in Iran. And for example, we were able to extend to 23 million households some loans through the mobile of the household head of the household, and the head of household would receive the loan, and then he would receive that in his bank account, and then we would deduct that from the subsidies that they would receive although the amount of loan was not significant, but this new method of providing assistance was a significant improvement in the way we offer services. This we offered with the help of UNICEF and UNFPA, we are designing and offering
Colleagues, we lost you. Dr. Medari? Okay, unfortunately, it seems like we have a connection challenge. What I'll suggest then is maybe to turn very quickly to George. There was a pending question which was about, you know, UBI, TBI, and gender. We didn't have the opportunity to address that. Would you like to come in very quickly on the gender dimension?
Yes, thank you, Mansour. I think one of the things that we've seen that became visibilized over the crisis period is the amount of unpaid care work that is actually in proportion to all of work in a household. So the numbers that are coming in upon which a universal basic income can affect or a TBI can affect are telling us that the proportion is actually, that gap is increasing. So what the debate that we've had inside UNDP at least is to start to look at some of the drivers behind that. What is driving labor force participation? What is driving the wedge between paid and unpaid care work? As you know, the average number of hours worked by women is about 3 times the one in men in developing and emerging economies. The question is, how do we go about compressing the time needed to close that gap? Not going to wait 3 generations for changes in social norms. We can nudge, regulate, and transform labor markets and social protection systems. So what's on the table now is coming out of TBI and coming out of the UBI debate is how to think about that interrelationship between social labor markets, social protection, and the care economy. So that's something that we'll be sharing soon with other colleagues and partners from other academic agencies.
So much, George. Before maybe I give Professor Louise Haigh just an opportunity to say a last word, I would just like to see whether Dr. Ashrafi is available, whether she wants to add anything.
Do you have?
Yes, Dr. Ashraf. Dr. Ashraf, yes, please go on. Yeah.
You know, the coronavirus imposed both demand and supply shock to Iran economy, the same as other economy. And you know, we have coronavirus in the time of sanction, and it was a very serious shock in our economic because of you know, before coronavirus, our oil exports go down. And in that time, the price of oil go down, and many business locked down, and people stay home to prevent the spread. And you know, because all of this, the government tried to have some different grants and subsidies to control the time. Some of the important policy is, you know, the helping that government to employee and the workers, and some part of the helping direct to household. All you know, the government pay subsidy to a household, and you know, one of our policy that we have it in 2009 was Justic Share. Justic Share you know, Justic Share are the share of government-owned company that were given to 6 lowest income decline of Iranian. In the you know, past of COVID, you know, government let people to tradable our share in a stock market. and they can use from the benefit of their share to have a better situation in quick time. You know, their 70% of their share can tradable in the stock market, and they have, you know, the Justice share profile include 49 state-owned company in the auto, metal, mining, and agriculture, petrochemical, and banking sector. That all of them have good situation in the, you know, share market. But you know, in this time, the situation of our household and employee not good. And I think UN and other international companies should to have a good helping for developing country. Exactly, some country that they are in sanction without political. And
thank you so much, Dr. Ashrafi. Unfortunately, we have run out of time. I'm just gonna ask, thanks again, Laura and Professor Haag, just 1 minute for last reflections, if any. Professor Haag and then Laura. Muted. You are muted. We cannot hear you, Professor Haag.
Right, sorry about that. I was going to say that I think an immediate positive of UBI, one that is stable, is that a financial structure that is stable could change women's lives significantly. And that is something that could happen on a more immediate basis. And that's both in the South, global South, and the global North. I mean, I've just read some work on illegal child marriage in India, which continues to persist. And one of the reasons are financial, is that families are locked into this expectation that girls are cost benefit financially. And even though education is available, it's not necessarily financially viable, or the expectation isn't that women can continue in education within traditional family structures. And a UBI changes the financial calculation because it is a stable payment and therefore can change the expectations. But it's also true in the global North, where we're seeing a growing divide between women in the middle class and lower class women who are subject to sanction systems that force them to work a certain amount of hours, and they cannot make the choice to care as well. So this idea of the care economy as being a woman's choice both ways, a UBI, I think, would make an important contribution.
So much, Professor Haag. Laura, any final thought before I wrap up and make the closing remarks?
No, muchísimas gracias. Yo solamente quería mencionar para los que preguntaron sobre la disponibilidad de la información de ingresos solidarios. Nosotros pues estamos trabajando paralelamente en la evaluación de impacto, de impactos tempranos, que es lo único que alcanzaríamos a medir este año. Ya tenemos unas simulaciones también en donde creemos que Ingreso Solidario ha logrado mitigar casi un 40% de ese incremento de pobreza, y esperamos entonces que estos estudios estén disponibles antes del cierre de año. Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you so much, Laura. This is very much appreciated. Colleagues, thanks so much to the panelists and everyone. This was a truly wonderful exchange of ideas. Let me just point to a number of remarks here from what I've heard. First, in terms of design and purpose, I think here there's clearly two views. Initially, UBI is for systemic change that could potentially also be assigned very specific roles like dealing with poverty. Overall, what we see is it's about, you know, a political change. And this is definitely about potentially new social contract that needs to be put in place. Third remark that I would note is that UBI on its own cannot make a meaningful change. What we're looking at is also how it's part of a overall social policy, you know, measures that can support these kind of transformational change that is needed. And in that regard, the care economy can be a very powerful lever to bring about that change that can happen in the longer term scenario. Fourth reflection is about its feasibility, its costs, and compared to its benefits. You know, there is some evidence that needs to be further clarified. And then a number of very specific challenges regarding good practices, like putting in place grievance mechanisms, making sure that you identify the right beneficiaries, leveraging both cross-reference databases, like administrative databases of others, the payment system, leveraging digital tools and means to make sure that the payment systems are optimized to reach all beneficiaries. Colleagues, that's as much as we could do in an hour. I would really like to thank you all. This was extremely useful. I understand that the materials that were here will be shared. So stay tuned for more. There are lots of upcoming events, and we look forward to continue engaging. Thanks again. Thanks to the panelists. Thank you to the audience, and also the organizers that are behind the scene and really supporting this wonderful event. Thanks to all.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mansour. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.